January 1944. A frozen English morning, the airfield cloaked in mist. The smell of fuel and metal thick around the Mustang rose. Inside one hangar, a single mechanic crouches beneath the cowling of a P-51, his hands black with oil, breath clouding in the cold. He isn't following the manual tonight. He's rerouting a cooling line, tightening a valve just a fraction past regulation. It's a risk, unapproved, undocumented, and unseen by command. But up there, at 30,000 feet, rules don't keep engines alive. Precision does. The pilot assigned to this aircraft will never know that something small has changed, that a thin channel of coolant will now run faster through the heart of his Merlin engine. When the sun rises, that same aircraft will climb higher than expected, its temperature needle steady while others flicker into the red. No medal will mark this adjustment, but it will quietly help make the P-51 Mustang the machine that turned the air war over Europe. The P-51 Mustang was never meant to become a legend. When North American aviation first proposed it in 1940, it was designed as a stopgap, a fighter for Britain, built in a hurry. Its first version, powered by an Allison engine, was fast and sleek but weak at high altitude. The Allison's single-stage supercharger starved for air above 15,000 feet, turning the Mustang into a low-level ground attack plane rather than a high-altitude escort. Yet even in those early tests, pilots noticed something remarkable. The aircraft's cooling system worked differently. Instead of dragging the plane down, its radiator seemed to push it forward. Engineers later called it the Meredith effect, a design that turned heat into thrust. But in 1941, no one realized how far that small idea would go. The heart of the problem lay in the European skies. Bombers needed escorts that could reach Germany and still fight at there. That's where the mechanics came in, the uncelebrated backbone of every squadron. They worked in freezing hangars, often by lantern light, with engines that had to fly again the next dawn. Their hands knew each sound, each smell, each vibration. Manuals could not predict what happened after hundreds of hours in combat conditions, or how a valve fatigued under repeated climbs to 25,000 feet. Field ingenuity filled those gaps. Mechanics adjusted coolant flow, modified thermostats, and experimented with flap positions. Most of it stayed undocumented. Small hacks that lived and died within each squadron. Some of these unapproved tweaks improved performance in ways the designers never anticipated. A tighter valve or a re-angled duct could mean a steadier temperature reading and a few more minutes of power before overheating. In the cockpit, that margin could be life or death. The P-51's radiator system was especially sensitive. Its ducting worked like a jet of heat. Too much drag wasted energy. Too little airflow risked meltdown. Finding the right balance was as much art as science. Back at the factories in California and at the Packard plant in Detroit, engineers tested systems under controlled conditions. But in Europe, conditions were anything but controlled. Ice, mud, and shrapnel altered every reading. Mechanics learned through trial and error what settings worked best in the real sky. And in one squadron, one particular adjustment, the rerouting of a coolant line, a subtle change in pressure, would stand out. It was never recorded as official procedure. But pilots who flew those aircraft noticed something. Their temperature gauges stayed calmer, their engines ran smoother, and their aircraft climbed higher without faltering. That quiet mechanical gamble, born of fatigue and necessity, became one of the invisible reasons the Mustang could perform Mira.
Wine, checked plugs and hoses, wiped frost from gauges, and every squadron had its share of improvisers, men who couldn't stop tweaking the machine until it performed exactly right. These men didn't hold engineering degrees. Most were in their 20s, some barely older than the pilots they kept alive. They had learned by instinct and repetition. They saw what the official procedures missed. That altitude changed everything. Thin air altered coolant pressure, airflow patterns, and even how radiators expelled heat. A configuration that worked perfectly at sea level might fail above 20,000 feet. Many mechanics realized that by adjusting the coolant bypass or slightly altering the radiator flap angle, they could smooth out temperature spikes that plagued the Mustang's performance. It was small, delicate work, often done without permission, because official channels moved too slowly. Reports from the 8th Air Force's 354th and 357th Fighter Groups described remarkable reliability in certain aircraft after local adjustments. Pilots noted that their engines stayed cooler during sustained climbs, even when chasing German fighters near 30,000 feet. The same flight models from neighboring units, untouched by those unofficial modifications, often ran hotter. Word spread quietly between bases, passed through coffee cups and late-night hangar conversations. No one wrote it down. They simply copied what worked. The North American engineers back home continued refining the radiator duct design, testing different flap settings and airflow ratios. But the field fixes were already teaching the same lessons through lived experience. The Mustang's scoop beneath its belly was more than a cooling duct. It was a delicate aerodynamic device that transformed heat into thrust. When adjusted precisely, it could add several miles per hour of effective speed. When malajusted, instead, it could drag the plane down. The mechanic who discovered the optimal balance, even accidentally, had found the key to sustaining that performance through long-range missions. The winter of 1944 was brutal. Snow covered the airfields, and maintenance was often done outdoors. Mechanics kept engines warm by draining oil and storing it in stoves overnight, then pouring it back before dawn. They used rags to insulate coolant lines and improvised heaters to prevent freezing. Amid those struggles, a few began experimenting with coolant circulation itself, noticing that minor rerouting could keep temperatures more stable. One such experiment, made in quiet defiance of procedure, would later draw attention from senior officers after pilots began reporting unusually steady readings and better altitude performance. No orders were ever issued acknowledging the change, but it would become part of squadron lore. The pilots simply knew their Mustangs could now climb higher and hold formation longer without the fear of overheating. The difference seemed small, a steadier needle, a smoother roar at altitude, but it symbolized a transformation in the air war. Behind every victory report and gun camera reel, there were cold, grease-stained hands making invisible adjustments that altered history. And soon, that unseen ingenuity would be tested over the frozen peaks of Germany, where the air thinned, engines strained, and every degree of heat could mean survival. The war's stories are usually told through the men who flew, but behind every flight was another kind of courage, the patience and stubbornness of those who repaired what others broke. The Mustang's ground crews carried the weight of perfection on their shoulders. Each night, they rebuilt what the day had nearly destroyed. Every plane had its own personality, its quirks and moods, its little noises that only one mechanic could understand. The Mustang was a beauty in the sky, but a temperamental beast on the ground. It leaked, it overheated, it demanded constant balance. The men who serviced it learned to read it like a living thing. They felt the tension in the bolts, the rhythm of the idle, the sharp scent that warned when something was off. When one of them found a way to make it run smoother, even slightly, it wasn't rebellion. It was survival instinct. The unapproved cooling fix was born from that same quiet devotion, a moment where duty to the pilot outweighed obedience to procedure. In the air war over Europe, altitude was everything. Bombers flew high to escape flak, and fighters followed them into thinner and colder skies. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and FW-190s excelled at mid-altitude combat, but above 25,000 feet their engines struggled. For the Allies, reaching that zone with power to spare meant dominance. The Mustang's advantage was not just speed or range. It was sustained performance at altitude. A cooler, more efficient Merlin engine meant longer escort endurance and more reliable climbs. That stability translated into tactics. Mustangs could stay with bombers deeper into enemy territory, peel off to engage interceptors, and return without losing engine performance. German pilots noticed how the P-51s held formation effortlessly, while their own aircraft began to wheeze in the cold, thin air. Each degree of reduced heat stress meant another day or minute of sustained combat, Another bomber saved. What began as a small mechanical adjustment rippled outward into new strategies and changed survival odds across the front. The P-51's radiator system was one of the most complex aerodynamic balances of the war. Hidden beneath the aircraft's smooth belly, the duct used the Meredith effect to turn waste heat into usable thrust. In simple terms, as hot air from the radiator expanded, it accelerated through the duct, generating a small jet-like push. The result was remarkable. The cooling system actually offset its own drag. But that design worked within razor-thin tolerances. The flow of coolant, the pressure inside the radiator, and the opening of the exit flap all had to align precisely. Too much coolant flow, and the system lost heat exchange efficiency. Too little, and the engine would overheat. Mechanics on the ground found themselves constantly chasing that perfect balance, adjusting thermostats, tweaking valves, and testing fan angles. The factory manuals couldn't predict how altitude or temperature shifts in Northern Europe would distort the equations. Field modifications often succeeded where theory failed. The unapproved change, subtle as it was, effectively improved coolant circulation and reduced temperature spikes. A tiny correction that let the Meredith effect function at its best. To pilots, the difference was visceral. A well-tuned Mustang felt alive, responsive, almost breathing with them. When the radiator system worked perfectly, the aircraft sliced through the sky with a hum that inspired confidence. When it didn't, the pilot felt the drag immediately. A sluggishness in climb, a creeping needle on the temperature gauge, a fear that one more minute at full power might melt the engine. That small hack made the difference between those two sensations. It wasn't an invention from a laboratory, but a fight, LD-born evolution. The kind that war, necessity, and human instinct often produce faster than any design bureau. That adjustment didn't just cool engines. It cooled fear. Pilots began to trust their Mustangs in ways they hadn't before. When they opened the throttle for pursuit, they no longer worried that the coolant would boil over. The machine and man became one efficient system. Power without panic. As word spread quietly through the squadrons, the idea of unapproved improvements gained a sort of sacred respect among mechanics. Each base had its local geniuses, the men whose aircraft never seemed to fail. Their methods were whispered, never written, but the results spoke loudly in the skies. And above all, these small acts of ingenuity changed not just machinery, but morale. In a war that demanded perfection from imperfect humans, that tiny adjustment was proof that even the smallest hands could alter the balance of power. Commanders lived in a world of rules, reports, and accountability. Every modification had to pass through channels, every deviation recorded. Yet in war, the front line often moved faster than the paperwork. Squadron leaders knew their men bent the rules to keep aircraft flying. Officially, they could not endorse it. Unofficially, they relied on it. The most respected commanders were those who trusted their crew's instincts. Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, for instance, valued results over manuals. He cared only that his Mustangs climbed, fought, and came home. When he heard that some of his mechanics were experimenting with radiator pressure and flap timing, he didn't punish them. He simply told them to keep what works. It was an unspoken understanding between ranks. The war demanded initiative at every level. By allowing quiet innovation, leadership created space for the kind of improvisation that rules could never design. The unapproved cooling fix lived in that gray zone, invisible to bureaucracy, essential to victory. Leadership was not about knowing every bolt. It was about knowing when to let experts lead from below. The Mustang's success was as much a triumph of command philosophy as engineering. Trust allowed the machine to evolve in real time, shaped by experience, urgency, and fear. From the ground, German observers noticed something changing in early 1944. The new American escorts no longer turned back at the Rhine. They stayed. Luftwaffe pilots flying the Bf-109G and Fw-190A began encountering P-51s at 30,000 feet, altitudes where Allied fighters had once faltered. The Mustangs no longer struggled with overheating during climbs or long pursuits. German reports described them as persistent and untiring, able to dive, climb, and re-engage without the expected drop in performance. Some German engineers suspected an aerodynamic improvement. Others blamed the Packard Merlin's two-stage supercharger. Few realized that part of the advantage came from something as small as coolant stability. In air combat, perception shaped morale. When an enemy seems immune to fatigue, the psychological toll deepens. German pilots began to dread the silver shapes that appeared above the bomber streams, circling with the calm confidence of hunters who knew their prey couldn't escape. The improved cooling efficiency meant those Mustangs could run their engines harder and longer, staying on station while others would have throttled back to avoid overheating. That
persistence gave them tactical dominance. Every minute gained in the thin, cold sky translated to another successful escort mission, another German squadron forced to disengage. To the Luftwaffe, the shift seemed sudden, almost supernatural. In truth, it was mechanical, a product of small human choices that added up to overwhelming effect. War is built on contradictions. Soldiers are taught to obey, yet survival depends on breaking rules at the right moment. The mechanic's unapproved fix captures that paradox perfectly. It was a moral gray act, technically insubordination, practically heroism. In an environment where conformity could cost lives, innovation became an act of loyalty. The manuals were written for machines, but the war was fought by men. Those men adapted, improvised, and occasionally defied the book because the book couldn't hear engines choke at dawn. Among mechanics, there was an unspoken brotherhood. They took pride in the aircraft they maintained, each one a reflection of their skill. They named them, decorated them, and treated them like living comrades. When a pilot returned safely, the ground crew felt the same relief. When one didn't, they stared at the empty revetment in silence, wondering if they could have done something more. That sense of responsibility drove their constant tinkering. The cooling fix wasn't rebellion. It was grief transformed into precision. After the war, many of those men faded back into civilian life without recognition. They returned to garages and workshops, carrying knowledge that had once changed the outcome of missions. They didn't boast about the hack that made the Mustang unbeatable at altitude. Most never even spoke of it. But the legacy of that mindset, of daring to think beyond instruction, lived on in aviation long after the last Mustang retired. The P-51 became the symbol of dominance in the air war, but of dramatic, a rerouted coolant return line, and a pressure valve tightened beyond spec. The change increased circulation efficiency at high altitude by a fraction. But that fraction would soon separate the living from the lost. As the bombers roared toward Germany, contrails carved long white scars across the sky. The Mustangs followed, climbing through the cold until cockpit glass frosted and breath turned to mist. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped below -40 degrees. The thin air taxed every moving part of the Merlin engine, pistons, bearings, and especially cooling systems. Normally, engines ran hotter as the planes climbed. Air density fell, heat exchange slowed, and radiator efficiency plunged. But that morning, pilots began to notice something strange. The temperature needles stayed steady, no flickering into the danger zone, no sudden spikes when they opened the throttle to chase. The unapproved fix, invisible to all but the mechanics who made it, was quietly doing its job. Over Germany, the Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. Dozens of Bf-109s and FW-90s clawed their way upward to intercept the bomber streams. For years, this had been their hunting ground, the high, thin altitudes where American escorts would fall away or lag behind. But now, as they rose into the contrails, they met Mustangs already waiting. The air exploded with tracers, flashes, and twisting trails of vapor. Major James Howard, flying his P-51 Ding Hao, found himself alone against more than 30 enemy fighters while protecting a formation of bombers near Oschersleben. For half an hour he fought continuously, diving, climbing, rolling, pushing his Merlin to its limits. In any other aircraft, the engine would have overheated, power fading with each minute. But Howard's Mustang held. The coolant temperature remained stable. The system never failed. When he landed on the English bases, word spread through the mess halls that something in the maintenance routine had worked miracles. Commanders noticed fewer engine failures, smoother power output, and steadier climb rates. Yet no one issued an official inquiry. The results spoke for themselves. War didn't reward curiosity, it rewarded outcomes. The hack stayed hidden, folded into the rhythm of daily work. By the time March arrived, the pattern was undeniable. The Mustangs that had received those quiet modifications were outperforming their counterparts. Pilots volunteered for those aircraft by tail number, not understanding why they trusted them more, only that they felt safer. And every successful escort, every bomber that made it home, reinforced the invisible legacy of that night in the hangar when one man decided to tighten a valve just a little more. The Mustang had proven itself in combat, not as a flawless machine from a drawing board, but as a living weapon shaped by human hands. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe had transformed into an arena where control of the air would decide the fate of the ground. The Allies knew that without air superiority, the coming invasion of France would be suicide. The Luftwaffe still had experienced aces, but the balance was shifting with every passing week. The Mustang was no longer just an escort, it was the symbol of that shift. At 28,000 feet, combat happened in silence broken only by engine roar and gunfire bursts. The P-51's Rolls-Royce Merlin, fed by its reworked cooling system, thrived in the thin, icy air. German pilots, once confident in their altitude advantage, found themselves cornered by aircraft that could not only reach them, but sustain combat longer. The tactical tables had turned completely. During one mission over Berlin in March, bomber formations of the 8th Air Force reached targets deep inside Germany for the Me
had spread quietly through whispers and imitation, a kind of underground innovation born of war's urgency. April brought the test that would cement the Mustang's legend. On April 11th, during one of the heaviest raids of the month, American bombers struck Leipzig and Oschersleben again. Hundreds of German fighters rose to meet them. For more than 2 hours, combat raged over central Germany. High above, the Mustangs tangled in dogfights that spiraled through layers of cloud and contrail. Captain Don Gentile, one of the leading Mustang aces, tore through an enemy formation near Hanover. His engine temperature remained steady even as he executed steep climbs and dives, firing in bursts that shredded enemy wings. Below him, wreckage streamed toward the earth in burning fragments. His ground crew later reported that his engine, after the mission, showed none of the heat fatigue that usually followed such strain. The pattern was unmistakable. Where the modified cooling lines had been installed, the Merlins held up longer, cleaner, tougher. What began as one man's defiance of protocol had now become an uncredited factor in the Allies' control of the skies. Official reports credited the Mustang's range, the engine's design, and the pilot's training. But beneath those reasons lay something more human. A single adjustment that turned the theoretical advantages of the Merlin into practical endurance under combat conditions. As spring turned to summer, the invasion of Normandy approached. The air campaign's success rested on the Allies' ability to keep the Luftwaffe grounded or broken. Daily missions destroyed airfields, supply depots, and aircraft production centers. Each Mustang sortie deep into Germany stretched the plane's limits, and the small tweak that improved cooling allowed pilots to sustain high speeds and altitude longer than design tests had ever intended. In May, when reconnaissance photos showed wrecked aircraft littering the airfields of northern France, General Karl Spaatz declared that the Luftwaffe had effectively been defeated in the air. The stage was set for D-Day. The P-51 had done what no other fighter could. It had carried the bombers to Berlin and back, kept its pilots alive, and drained the Luftwaffe of its veteran corps. It was fast, elegant, deadly, and unbreakable at altitude. That last trait, unknowingly, belonged as much to a nameless mechanic as to the designers who built it. As summer dawned over the English countryside, rows of Mustangs waited on the grass airstrips for orders that would define history. The engines purred smoothly, coolant systems humming, radiators gleaming under dew. Pilots climbed aboard, strapping themselves into cockpits that smelled of fuel and oil. Above them, the sky was the same pale blue it had been months earlier when the first unapproved wrench had turned in defiance of a manual. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. The results spoke louder than any signature. The unapproved cooling hack had made the Mustang more than a machine. It had made it immortal in the cold, thin air where legends were forged. The invasion of Normandy was now only days away, and the Mustang's invincibility at altitude would ensure that when the ships crossed the channel, no German eye in the sky would stop them. And with that quiet victory in the air came the inevitable aftermath that would change the course of the war itself. June 6, 1944. Dawn crept over the English Channel, revealing a horizon filled with ships. More than 5,000 of them. Operation Overlord had begun. But above the steel tide, another force was already at work, unseen, unheard, yet decisive. The P-51 Mustang swept across northern France, patrolling the skies with absolute dominance. There were no German fighters waiting to pounce on the invasion armada. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was crippled. That dominance had been forged over months of relentless combat and sustained endurance. The same endurance made possible by the mechanical ingenuity that had quietly rewritten the rules of flight at high altitude. Pilots now flew deeper and longer, free from the constant fear of overheating engines or coolant failure. The Mustang could climb to 30,000 feet, dive into combat, and return without losing power. It could outlast anything Germany had left. For the pilots, it meant confidence. For the ground crews, it meant validation. But for the nameless mechanic who had started it all, it was simply proof that necessity could outthink bureaucracy. His small forbidden adjustment, once a risk, had become an invisible cornerstone of victory. It was never mentioned in field reports or official technical bulletins. No citation bore his name. Yet every Mustang that soared unbroken over France that morning carried his legacy within its steel veins. Over Normandy, the Mustangs strafed rail lines, bridges, and convoys. They hunted German reinforcements trying to reach the beaches. Without enemy air cove, Allied troops could move and fight freely. It was air supremacy on a scale unseen before in history. German commanders, once relying on Luftwaffe reconnaissance and airstrikes, now fought blind. Their divisions moved in daylight only at mortal risk. In the days that followed, Allied air power became an instrument of precision destruction. The Mustang led the charge, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, cutting off retreat routes, crippling logistics. Its cooling system, once its weakest link, was now its strength. Engines ran steady under full throttle, high above the smoke and chaos of battle. By late June, American airmen had destroyed nearly 2,000 German aircraft in the skies over France and Western Germany. The Luftwaffe had been bled beyond recovery. Factory output could no longer match the rate of losses. What remained of German fighter groups was forced into defensive actions, conserving fuel, retreating eastward. The skies belonged to the Allies. Mechanics on the ground began to formalize what they had once hidden. The coolant line modification spread quietly through squadrons as a kind of open secret. It was never documented officially. To do so might have exposed them to reprimand. But it became part of the culture. In hangars across England and France, the same subtle wrench turn became ritual before flight. Commanders didn't ask. They didn't need to. The Mustangs kept flying. The results spoke with every mission that returned safely. every bomber that came home intact, every German position reduced from above. The war in the air was now a one-sided affair. In Berlin, Luftwaffe officers studied the reports in disbelief. Their fighters were faster in short bursts, sometimes more maneuverable at lower altitudes, but the Mustangs simply refused to falter. Even during desperate climbs or prolonged chases, the American planes showed no sign of heat stress. Engineers couldn't understand how the same Merlin engines performed better in combat than in captured test models. They never learned the truth, that the difference wasn't in the factory design, but in a single quiet act of field innovation. As summer deepened, Allied forces broke out from Normandy. The Mustangs followed them across France, supporting every advance. At low level, they strafed convoys. At altitude, they swept the skies clean. Their engines roared over retreating German columns like a reminder that the era of Luftwaffe dominance was over. By August 1944, the Allies had complete control of the air from Normandy to the Rhine. The war was still brutal, but now it was fought under an Allied sky. And within that dominance lay a secret victory, one earned not by a general or a designer, but by a mechanic who had once decided that following the manual wasn't enough to win a war. The cooling hack had given the P-51 Mustang endurance that turned the tide of the air war. But what came next would reveal just how deeply that victory would echo, in numbers, in strategy, and in history. By September 1944, the thunder of Allied bombers filled the skies over Western Europe almost daily. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German military genius, was now a shadow of its former self. Its veteran pilots were dead or captured, its fuel reserves nearly gone, and its factories lay in ruins. The Allies' relentless bombing campaign had achieved what no single battle could: total strategic dominance from the air. And at the heart of that triumph was the P-51 Mustang, sleek, reliable, and unstoppable at high altitude. The statistics told the story better than any speech. Between February and September 1944, the 8th Air Force lost less than one bomber per mission on average, a staggering improvement over the losses of 1943, when 1 in 5 bombers failed to return. Fighter escort effectiveness had skyrocketed. More than 17,000 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed during that period, and the Mustang accounted for nearly half of those kills. For the Allies, it was proof that the balance of power had permanently shifted. Yet few understood that the Mustang's consistency, its ability to hold power through hours of high-altitude flight, wasn't solely the product of design brilliance. It was the quiet triumph of field engineering. Each aircraft that soared over Germany had been touched by human hands that refused to accept limits. Mechanics, inspired by results they couldn't publicly claim, standardized the unapproved fix across squadrons. It became folklore, something every good crew knew but never wrote down. Pilots felt the difference immediately. Reports from combat units told the same story: cooler operating temperatures, better climb performance, and longer sustained fights. Engines that once struggled during extended combat now returned with perfect compression readings. The hack, as crews called it in whispers, had made the Mustang nearly invincible in the thin air where every second of power meant survival. This mechanical edge did more than keep planes aloft. It changed strategy itself. With reliable high-altitude escorts, Allied planners could now launch raids deeper into German territory than ever before. Cities like Munich, Stuttgart, and even Berlin were no longer safe. No corner of the Reich was beyond reach. German radar operators grew used to seeing endless formations of bombers crossing their screens, with tight groups of fast, steady dots weaving among them. They knew those dots were Mustangs, and they knew what that meant. Even when the Luftwaffe tried to field new aircraft, the Me-262 jet fighter, the FW-190D, the outcome didn't change. The P-51s held the airspace with confidence, hunting jets during their vulnerable takeoff and landing runs. Allied pilots no longer feared climbing to meet their enemies. They owned the sky's upper reaches, where the cold was lethal and engines were tested to the limit. The Mustang's steady cooling under those conditions gave them not just survival, but supremacy. By the time Allied troops crossed the Rhine in March 1945, air opposition had all but vanished. The P-51s flew unchallenged patrols over a collapsing Reich, their missions shifting from escort to reconnaissance and ground attack. From the cockpit, pilots could see the devastation below. Cities reduced to ash, railways torn apart, armored divisions retreating under relentless strafing runs. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's terror, was finished. In post-war reports, engineers analyzed why the Mustang had performed so well. They credited its laminar flow wings, its powerful Merlin engine, its drop tanks, and its balanced design. But buried deep in maintenance logs were small, consistent notes. Improved coolant return, adjusted pressure relief, modified bypass line. They never made it into official publications. Yet those cryptic remarks pointed back to that one unapproved idea that had changed everything. When peace finally came in May 1945, the surviving Mustangs lined the airfields of Europe like resting stallions, their engines quiet, their wings scarred, their radiators still shining beneath layers of dust and oil. Some would go home. Others would stay behind, abandoned as new jets replaced them. But all carried the legacy of a generation of mechanics who had learned that victory in war often comes not from the plans of generals, but from the courage of those who dare to think differently. Years later, veterans would recall the Mustang not just as a plane, but as a feeling. The sound of freedom at full throttle, high above the clouds where the air was thin and the stakes were absolute. Few would ever know that part of that invincibility came from a man with a wrench, working in the dark, trusting his instincts more than the manual. From that act of quiet rebellion came endurance. From endurance came dominance, and from dominance, victory. The world had changed forever, but the story of how it happened was still waiting to be told. History often celebrates the names that appear on medals and blueprints, the pilots who fought in the sky and the engineers who designed the machines. But wars are also won by those who never see their work in the headlines. The nameless mechanic who defied the rulebook and trusted his understanding of metal and motion left behind no photograph, no citation, not even a full record of his name. Yet his decision rippled across the war, saving lives and shaping victories far beyond his sight. The P-51 Mustang became the defining symbol of Allied air power, a machine that embodied the perfect union of British engineering, American manufacturing, and human courage. Its long range, blistering speed, and endurance at altitude made it the weapon that finally broke Germany's hold over the skies. But inside that story of innovation and design lies the quieter truth, that even perfection on paper can fail without the intuition of those who live beside the machine every day. That unapproved cooling hack was not born in a laboratory or written into a manual. It came from observation, from necessity, and from the unspoken understanding that survival sometimes means bending the rules. In the sterile logic of command, it was an error. In the harsh logic of war, it was genius. When the war ended, the P-51 stood not only as a triumph of technology, but as a monument to adaptability, to the idea that victory comes from countless unseen hands, each tightening a bolt, adjusting a line, or trusting a hunch. It reminded the world that progress is rarely neat or authorized. Sometimes it is built in silence, in the hangar after midnight, by someone who refuses to accept good enough. The Mustang went on to serve in Korea and beyond, flying under new flags and in new wars. But its heart, the Merlin engine that once burned hotter than it should have, never forgot the lesson it carried, that the smallest act of defiance, done for the right reason, can change the course of history. And so, high above the clouds where the air grows thin and engines strain against the cold, the spirit of that mechanic still hums, quiet, unseen, and eternal.